Hello, everyone, and welcome to our departmental series in the Department of Education Research at Lancaster University. Today we have Bekir Gur with us, and he's going to be talking about his research, Inequality in Transition to High Schools in Turkey. So before we start, there's a couple of things that I need to disclose. The seminar is being live streamed for postgraduate students, staff, and other interested people who can ask questions at the end of the presentation or via the chat box. So after Bekir's presentation, there's going to be question and answer session. You could ask your questions, or you could post your questions to the chat session, which I will be monitoring. The session will also be recorded, and the recording will be available on the department website. So before we start, please can all attendees switch off their cameras and mute their microphone during the presentation. That would be quite good if you can do that, and thank you all. And right, our presenter today is Bekir Gur. He holds a PhD in instructional technology from Utah State University. He is an associate professor at Ankara Yildirim Beyazit University, Turkey. Previously, he was on a visiting research appointment at the Center of Studies in Higher Education at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as was an advisor to the Minister of National Education of Turkey. Currently, he is also an advisor to the President of the Council of Higher Education. His primary research interests include data science, computational social science, educational policy studies, comparative and international education, and higher education. So welcome again, Bekir, and here is to you. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you, Murat, for your nice introduction. I would like to also start by thanking to Melissa and Jonathan for their kind invitation. And I know many colleagues from Lancaster University by their academic studies, and I am very happy to be here. Today in my talk, I will focus on the last 2 decades of Turkish education. Specifically, I will talk about the transition from the middle school to high schools, or from primary school to secondary school. And as you may know, in Turkey, we have a centralized or standardized or national exam for this transition. So students from 8th grade take this exam, and then according to the exam, they are placed into a high school program based on their choice and based on their scores. So firstly, I will give some background information about Turkish education. And then I will focus on the national exams utilized for this transition to high schools over the last 2 decades. I will also give some brief information about the changes to these transition systems. As I explain in a moment, we have several different systems in the last 2 decades. And I will also provide an explanation for how or why we have made these changes. After that, I will present the results of some of my studies with my colleagues on the inequality in this transition from middle school to high schools. I will also incorporate some official statistics and some international comparisons. And let me also state that these slides are available online. I have uploaded to my website, so if anybody would like to, reach them, they can download from my website. And before I talk about the transition into high schools, I think we should note that Turkish education system has always been under pressure from the university entrance exam. So before we talk about high schools, we need to talk about higher education, because there is a big competition over there. And that competition has direct consequences for high schools. So there has been, as you see in the graph, there has been a great unmet demand for higher education. For instance, in 2000, about 1.4 million students took the Central University Entrance Examination. But only 400,000 of them were admitted to universities. So about 1 million of them were not admitted to universities or colleges. And as of 2022, about 3,200,000 students. I'm sorry, 3,200,000 students take the exam, and about only 1 million of them were admitted again into colleges or universities. So most of the students keep retaking the exam because they are not being placed in a program of their choice. So there has been and still an imbalance between demand and supply for higher education. As you may notice in the graph, except in 2009, because in 2009, most high schools didn't graduate students because there has been a change to duration of high schools. And at that time, duration of high schools were extended from 3 years to 4 years. So most high schools didn't graduate at that year. So that's why the number of exam takers were dropped, but the number of admitted students were about the same for the last decade. So this imbalance for higher education, and there is only one way to enter into higher education because there is only just one central examination just once in a year. This imbalance for higher education creates pressure for admitting into a selective high school. So most people spend money for their kids to go to a selective high schools. So they take private tutoring, or they send their students to private schools in the middle school so that they can go into a selective high school. So before I talk about the exams and the changes made about the exams, I think we have to spend a little bit more time on this, because unless we understand this persistent problem, I don't think we can understand the pressure on high school and how we keep reproducing inequality in our system. So why we had this problem? I think this is related with the late expansion of higher education system in Turkey. So the first problem that I would like to point about is related with the late expansion. As you may see in the graph, blue and dark blue provinces represent the cities that had already universities before 2000, before 1992 actually. So before 1992 in Turkey, although we has 81 provinces, most of the provinces didn't have universities. So to be exact, only 40 provinces had universities at that time. But 41 provinces didn't have universities or colleges at that time. So when we entered into after 2000, there was a newly elected government in 2002, which is the ruling current party. And at that time, the government response to this great demand for higher education was to establish new universities in mostly less developed regions of Turkey. So in 2006, 2007, 2008, government established a total of 41 universities in these provinces. So while the expansion of higher education system alleviated the problem regarding the unmet demand for higher education, still the university entrance exam continued to be the biggest pressure on the entire education system, because most of these newly established programs were not considered as more selective or of quality. So the pressure on the education system from the university entrance exam continued up until this day. And the second problem that we have to, I think, understand before we talk about the exams and the transition is the problem of hierarchy among high schools or high school types. So there is a definite hierarchy among high school types in Turkey. By hierarchy, I mean high schools are ranked based on their entrance scores, which in fact are related to their university entrance scores, because these schools are selective schools, especially science high schools are selective schools. So kids with the high scores enter into these high schools, and then when they go to apply to university entrance examination, they have highest, average scores. So the students and families choose or compete for high schools that have high average scores in university entrance exams. So this graph, based on official statistics of 2022, shows that there is a huge variation in terms of placement rates among different high school types. By placement rates, I mean placement into a college program. So just for the sake of consistency, let me remind you that these statistics or the figures in this graph are calculated for the newly graduates in 2022, or those who participated in university entrance examination for the first time. So at the top of the hierarchy, you see science high schools, and they have like 44% of their graduates are placed in a 4-year higher education program or a bachelor program, 44% of them. But at the bottom of the hierarchy, you see vocational high schools, and only 3% of their graduates are placed in a 4-year program. Somewhere in between, between the top and bottom, we see regular high schools or Anatolian high schools, which is called in Turkish, Anatolian high schools. They have like 18% of their graduates are placed in a 4-year program. So like the aims of science high schools and Anatolian high schools are very similar to each other, almost the same aims. But we see their like placement rates are very different from each other. So this achievement gap or the hierarchy between high school types in Turkey, I think that standouts the most fundamental problem of high schools or secondary education in Turkey. And actually, this problem is very well known. Like the problem of hierarchy among high schools in Turkey has been noted in many international reports. For instance, this figure is taken from a report by the World Bank from 2013. And as you can see in the graph, at least 10 different types of high schools, like vocational high school, general high schools, science high schools, etc. There are so many different types of schools, and all of them are being sampled in the PISA assessment. And as you can see from the vertical line, average reading scores are very different from each other. So there are great or considerable performance differences between students of this different type of high schools. And let me also remind you that PISA assess 15 years of age students. So all of the students are 15 years of age. And if you look at this report, the World Bank report, it states that students in the best program, which is science high schools, had PISA scores that were on average 147 points higher than students in the stream with the lowest score, which is vocational schools. So this gap represents more than 3 years of schooling. So again, all of them are 15 years of age, but those students who are going to science high schools performing about 3 years of schooling, or better performing about 3 years of schooling, which is around 147 points. So there is a great performance difference between these school types. So this streaming process or this tracking occurs in the transition from 8th grade to 9th grade. And as I said, this situation has been noted in many international reports, like for instance, an OECD report also note that the selection process that streams students into different kinds of high schools according to their abilities is likely to have an effect on their academic performance. And also when Turkey joins OECD's PISA for the first time in 2003, one of the results was very shocking, I think, because as you can see in the graph, in terms of between school variance, Turkey tops the figure. Turkey has the scores with the most between school variance among all the OECD countries or all the PISA participating countries. And in that report also, the report notes that on average, across OECD countries, differences in performance of 15 years olds between schools account for about 34% of the OECD average between student variance. But in Turkey, variation in performance between schools is particularly large and is about twice the OECD average between school variance. So, I mean, this is very important, and we can also see similar mentions in our national reports, in official reports, and but as I will show in a moment, although this problem has been very well known for about 2 decades, still we have very similar problems. So we have to discuss whether our policies are working or not, or whether we are following the right direction or not. And also, while there was a hierarchy among high school types, there was another challenge, because education system in Turkey has been coping to meet with the increasing demand for education. As you can see, there were only 2.4 million high school students in Turkey in 2000. The number almost doubled to 4.7 million by 2010. And after 2012, in which in Turkey there was a extension of mandatory schooling, so the mandatory schooling was extended from 8 years to 12 years. So by the 2022, right now we have about 6.5 million students in high schools. So there is a great challenge by the increasing demand for education as well. So the system was expanding rapidly amid the imbalance between supply and demand for education, as well as the hierarchy among high schools. So you may ask at this point, what was the response of policymakers against these challenges and problems? So, well, the policymakers were panicking. Unfortunately, frequent changes were made in the transition between education levels. And the main reason behind these changes is the criticism that central exams negatively affect the education system. So people argue that central examinations increase students' stress and anxiety. Also, people criticize that current tests do not adequately assess student learning, or students have to take private lessons and courses for these exams. So all this criticism created a pressure on the policymakers. So policymakers think that the transition system is the major problem. So they had this kind of assumption: if we made some improvements in the system or the transition system, then it will also increase, that will also translate it into as an increase in the quality of education system. All these changes, and we had different changes, the policymakers aimed several things. One of them was they wanted to minimize students' dependency on what they called out-of-school resources or private lessons. They also wanted to assess student achievement and competencies in a comprehensive way. They also wanted to reduce test anxiety or to increase the quality of education. So these are the like declared aims of the policymakers. And this figure that you see, we draw this one is in August 2012. And at that time, there was only 3 major changes. Like one of them in from 2005 to 6, the other one 2008 to 9, and the other one 2011 to 12. And people were speculating at that time whether there should be another change. And we, like when we wrote this report, there was no systemic change at that time. But that's why we put a question mark over there. And then, as I will show you in a moment, there were going to be another 2 major systemic change from that time to up until now. So, in 2004, we had a system which is called OKS, etc. So we have too many acronyms, you know. But basically, although the type of the exams changed among these systems, all of them had centralized exams. One of them had like 3 exams, one of them had just 1 exam, one of them had like 6 exams per semester, etc. So different kind of exams, but the common thing among the old system is they had a centralized system, centralized exams across all the systems. And I'm especially going to talk about the last 2 ones. So TEOG, or TEOG in Turkish, was ministry used TEOG between 2013 and 2017. So in this system especially, this is markedly different from the other systems because all incoming high school students were placed in a high school based on their standardized exam scores. So this is very different from the other ones because all the other systems, we had like selective schools, and if the student would like to go to those selective schools, then they have to take you know, these standardized exams. But otherwise, they are fine. They can go to just a regular high school, which is close to their home, etc. But in this system, all the students, no matter which school they want to go, they have to enter into this exam. They are going to have an exam score, and based on that exam score, students are going to be placed in a high school of their choice. And after 2018, we had what's called LGS. And after 2018, somewhere between 10% or 15% of all incoming students were placed in high schools based on their exams scores. So again, about 10% of the high schools were deemed as selective high schools, and those high schools accepting their students based on their national standardized exam scores. So using several recent studies based on large data sets obtained from the Ministry of National Education and as well as other studies, I will talk about the socioeconomic inequality in this transition to high schools. And also, I would like to comment on the impact of these recent changes on the high schools in Turkey. This is one of our recent studies that was published in like 2021. And as you may see, the authors, this, you know, like Eren Sunal, Mahmut Özer, Sadri Şensoy, Selahattin Gelbel, and Petek Ashkar. The second author is our current Minister of National Education. At that time, he was Assistant Minister of Education. So he's one of the co-authors, and our current minister also knows the problems very well because you know, we conduct this study together. And what we did was in Turkey we have centralized what's called e-school database. All the information of the students have to have in that database. So we took their, like we used sex, middle school type, family income level, mothers and fathers education level, class and school size, as well as teacher seniority or their service years. How many years have been teaching or have they been teaching, and also in-service training. How many days have they have got in-service training. And we took this information and we combined with their high school entrance exam scores, which is centralized, standardized score. And why we did this study? Because yes, there are related studies, and most of them utilize international large-scale assessments such as PISA, but this is a high-stake exam. So we wanted to understand, like we wanted to determine the factors related to academic achievement by using data from a high school or high-stake exam. And what we have found is, like we have found significant relationships among school size and academic achievement. And this is consistent with the previous studies. And the level of competition between schools is high in large schools and classes, which increase average achievement. So the fact that the class sizes are concurrent with the school size in Turkey should be considered. What I mean is, the bigger the school, the bigger the class. So what does this mean for inequality? It means that the number of large size schools are especially higher in metropolitan cities and regions. And those regions with the high socioeconomic levels. So there was an inequality in terms of the school size or the distribution of the school size. And also in this study, we also, consistent with our objective of the study, we wanted to measure between school variance. And between school variance was calculated for verbal achievement and numerical achievement. And we used, in order to calculate between school variance, we used intra-class correlation coefficient. And our results demonstrate that between school variance explains about 27 or 24% of the variation in students' verbal and numerical achievement, respectively. These rates are slightly lower than those studies which use international large-scale studies, such as PISA. If you remember, I showed a result from PISA 2003. In that graph, the between school variance was much larger than these figures. But still, these figures or between school variance can explain the differences in student achievement and remains important to a significant extent. And our finding related to teacher seniority, I think, is very important. And teacher seniority is among the variables most significantly related to student achievement. So this result, again, which is consistent with those of the national and international large-scale assessments, highlights the importance of the professional seniority of teachers. The wide gap between student achievement in Turkey is remarkable. And in general, teachers in Turkey begin their professional life in disadvantaged regions and move to socioeconomically advantaged regions and schools as they gain seniority. So in Turkey, teachers have a point-based merit system. Let's say there are feelings in southeastern part of Turkey, so they have to start their career over there. And then as they have gain seniority, they can move toward the west. Okay, so this system seems to cause the unequal distribution of teachers based on their seniority across regions and cities. I would like to give a simple example. In Ankara, which is the capital city of Turkey, the teachers, I'm talking about public teachers, the teachers on average have 16 years of service or seniority. But in Şırnak, which is in southeastern part border, if you see just here, we have like at the right corner, we have Hakkari and we have Şırnak. In Şırnak, which is in the southeastern corner part of Turkey and considered as, you know, underdeveloped city, the teachers on average have only 2 years of service. So think about it. I mean, we have a public system, and in one part of the country, teachers have average of 16 years of service, and at the other part of the country, we have only just 2 years of service. So I think there is something wrong with the way we distribute our teachers, and you know, when we take into seniority into consideration. And also in another study, in order to understand the since we have so many changes, we want to understand the systemic effect of these changes. For this particular study, we want to understand whether students' mathematical achievement change significantly after these systemic changes. And for this particular study, we take into we want to statistically control, you know, students' gender, age, parent education level, and their 8th grade achievement. After we controlled all these variables, we found that a significant, sharp decrease in the 9th grade mathematical achievement occurs after every systemic change in this transition exam. So whenever we have a systemic change, a student's achievement drops, you know, so this is consistent across all the changes. Additionally, the largest decrease was in this period from 2013 to 2014, and this largest decrease is found in what we call TEOG or TEOG, in which all students had to take into exam. They had to take into exam, and we see that after this system was introduced, their achievement scores dropped the most. So based on these results, in our article, we recommended to make incremental improvements rather than, you know, radical changes to alleviate the problems in high school transition systems. And from that time now, we haven't had any, you know, systemic change in Turkey, but I don't know whether we will have similar changes in the future or not. So up until now, I have been talking about the visible problem. Yes, hierarchy problem is very visible. I mean, like people know this problem very well. But this problem actually has another side, which is invisible. Like on the left side, we see all the different types of high schools have average like TEOG scores or TEOG scores. And we see there is a sharp difference among different types of high schools. But on the right side, we see that beneath this achievement gap between the school types, there is a hierarchy of socioeconomic levels of students. I mean, this is very important, I think. And again, this is consistent with the PISA findings. But in this particular study, with one of my doctoral students, Zeliha Cingöz, conducted a study she wanted to explain TEOG scores by using PISA survey. So we wanted to understand, again, this is a high-stake exam. So we used PISA survey to explain a high-stake exam. And the result shows that those students with the most affluent backgrounds go to the most advantageous schools. Again, what is striking, I think, is the fact that the achievement gap between school types is created by an exam conducted by the state, which defines itself not as a neoliberal state, but as a social welfare state. Again, a similar study was conducted like 2 years ago, and we conducted a similar study, again using a large data set from the Ministry of National Education. We compared the parental education levels of students who were admitted to science high schools versus all other high school students. And let me remind you that science high school considered as the top high schools in Turkey. That's why we focused on those schools in this particular study. And again, like over here, red represent lower education level, blue represent middle level education, and gray ones represent high education levels of parents. And our results show that those students who go to the science high schools come from the most educated families. Like, just give an example, in 2019, all other high schools, when we take into consideration of the all students, only 14% of their parents had high education. But in the same year, for science high schools, 45% of their parents come from a background of higher education. So like, we had similar results for mothers' education levels as well as family income. So there was, again, a similar pattern for mothers' education level and family income. And all of these results are available in that article. So this is my last slide. So where do we go from here? Like, after we see there is a striking visible and invisible hierarchy problem, and parental education and socioeconomic status affects the achievement in this transition exam. Where do we go from here? First of all, let me just state that yes, there has been so much criticism regarding this education system and education dependency on the centralized exams. We have had very few empirical studies. So we need more, I think, empirical studies on this topic. And also, although we have made so many changes, and the policymakers argued that after these changes, there will be less stress on students or on the education system, still we have continued concerns about stress. So we have to again question whether those targets were achieved or not. So that's why I think we have to need a policy change, and we need more data-driven decision making. And this is also related with the rhetoric about objectivity versus fairness. So which is unfortunate, I think, as a nation, and which is similar to across many nations in the world. I think we need to stop rhetoric about the objectivity of national or standardized exams. I think we need to pay more attention to the fairness in designing these transition systems. And in order to distance ourselves from the standardized exam, I think we have to value and increase public trust in school grades. And unfortunately, we have low public trust in school grades, so school grades are not considered as a good or valid predictor or valid tool for admitting students into high schools. So we have to change that public perception. Also, new policies should be designed to decrease this achievement gap between high schools. As I mentioned, in 2018, which is current, a new system has been started. And at that time, the Minister of National Education announced that only 10% of the students were going to be admitted to these selective schools. But now it's about 16% of the students were admitted to these selective high schools. So the number keep increasing. So maybe if we keep this current system, more and more schools are being labeled as selective schools, and more schools perhaps may admit students based on this standardized exam. So again, back to the future, you know, we have seen these changes before. So perhaps in the future we may have similar discussions again. And another policy areas that I think we should focus on is related to the distribution of these qualified or senior teachers. They should be assigned to schools in a fair and equitable manner based on students' needs or school needs rather than teachers' personal preferences. So yes, a teacher would like to work in a more developed regions, but those students need them in different places. So we have to find a balance and fair manner to distribute these teachers. And I think with that, I conclude my presentation, and I would be very happy to hear your comments. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to hear them.
Well, thank you so much, Bekir. That was very nice, a very illuminating presentation for me, and I'm sure the audience share the same thoughts. Yeah, so this is now our question and answer time. So any questions, please do raise your hand so we can notice you in this participant list. Also, if you have a question, you can write that on the chat box, and I could read that from out loud. In fact, we have one question during the presentation that came from Aykut Öztürk, who is asking, do we know what proportion of students are enrolled across these 4 types of high schools? I think that was referring specifically to either slide number 2 or 3, or I noticed the question came quite early.
You mean Aykut Öztürk questions, right? Do we know what proportion of students are enrolled across different or these 4 types of high schools? Let me go back to that slide, and then we can talk. Like about 2-3% of the students go to science high schools. So they are really, considered as successful students. And those students are really considered as, very selective schools. Imam Hatip schools, which are considered as religious high schools, about 10% of our high school students go to Imam Hatip schools. The proportion is around 10%. And regular high schools, about more than 30, close to 40% of our students go to these, regular Anatolian high schools. And vocational high is around close to 40%. And we have also other like smaller types of high schools, which I did not list over here for the sake of simplicity.
Right, thank you so much. Again, if you have more questions, please either raise your hand or type on the chat box. So yes, Mika, I just saw that you raised your hand first.
Yes, thank you for this interesting presentation. So if I understood this correctly, so you still have central exams and standardized testing.
Yes.
But even despite those standardized testing, you see a huge social inequality in the type of high school that people are entering. And that's kind of strange because international comparative research is always saying that in those countries with standardized testing, the system would be more fair because teachers can't let play their expectations, for example, in giving advice. So we in Founders, we don't have any standardized testing yet. So we don't have any central exams. They're working on it. And so one of the arguments they're using is that those standardized tests would be more fair, more objective. And so therefore we could get rid of the social inequality, which is quite large in our system too. So you've seen the PISA data, we're fourth in between school differences. So we have kind of the same situation in inequality. So I was wondering, what is your explanation for the fact that even though you have those standardized testing, there's still that huge social inequality? Do people game the system, for example, or what's happening?
No, because as I tried to explain, they have like different teachers who have different level of seniority. Mm-hmm. So like the students with the most most disadvantaged regions, who need more professional teachers, or who need teachers with more experience, they have the least experienced teachers. Mm-hmm. So like there is a regional imbalance in terms of like distribution of teachers with experience. And we know from our studies, like teacher seniority has direct effect on student achievement. There is one, I think, reason. Also, another reason is this: students do not have equal chances of opportunity in terms of preparing themselves for these centralized exams. So those families with the most resources, who have they can afford to send their kids to private schools or private tutoring centers, which we have so many in Turkey. So those families from the, especially from the mid-income level or upper income level, they send their kids to private tutoring centers. They take private lessons for their kids, so they have they become more successful. Mm-hmm. So making an objective test or making an objective exam for these students does not make the system fair. Mm-hmm. Because students do not have equal opportunity to for preparation for this kind of exams. Of course, there are different options for this, like policy options. You may say that yes, objective tests are a good and valid predictor or valid factor in admitting students. So why not providing more resource to all students? Why not providing more tests or booklets to kids so that they can prepare to exams? And this is the current policy of the Ministry of National Education, but I don't think it will work. I don't think it will work because the inequality is so huge. It cannot be compensated by this kind of incremental policies. I think we have to decrease the number of these exam schools. We have to decrease the number. Yes, we can keep a certain number of them, like maybe 1%, 2%. It's a matter of policy. We can discuss this. It could be 5%, etc. But right now the problem is, since 10% of the students in 2018 and now 16% of students go to these schools, the rest of the school is considered as unqualified or unsuccessful. and those kids are being labeled as such. That this is a big problem, I think. I mean, like labeling effect is really a major problem. We have to be very careful because these are like 15 years old kids, and we see a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy because those students go to like a school which considered as not very quality school. They deem themselves as such. And this is, I think, a very problematic situation. And I haven't presented over here, but we have also made several qualitative studies, and our qualitative studies show that like there is de facto curriculum differentiation among schools. So if you go to a selective school, you see a more challenging curriculum, but if you go to just a regular school, you see just a relaxed, version of curriculum, and that makes you less prepared for university entrance examination. But again, like we need, I think, more. As you are right, I mean, we need more international comparative studies. And also we need more studies using our national data.
Yeah, thank you. That's confirmation of what I thought was happening. So, but very illuminating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And now we have a question from Chetin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. That was really excellent. So I have been working on the issue for some time, Bekir Hocam. I have a couple of questions. Actually, just one comment before my questions relating to Micah's point. I guess standardized exams by nature are bad, but their timing is also pretty critical. So the early standardized test creates or generates really bad results, because the earlier the standardized exam is, the higher the effects of the socioeconomic resources of the family on the student's achievement. I guess your graphs already proves that. So I have a couple of questions. First, the years of teaching, it seems that this is really critical, but the provinces you mentioned, they are also Kurdish populated provinces. So I'm really wondering, how would you reflect on that? Because this is a standardized test pretty early, and some of these students who are residing in these Kurdish populated cities are coming from the households in which Kurdish is spoken. So in these tests, they are trying to compete with their Turkish counterparts at quite early age. Do you think that would be sort of affecting their academic success or placement in those standardized tests? And another one, the recent, recent reform regarding this standardized test, as far as I remember, imposes that students can be sorted into, if they are not able to collect good enough grades, they can be sorted into the schools they are existing, which are existing in their neighborhoods, which basically means if you are coming from a poor socioeconomic background, then you are residing in a poor neighborhood, then you would have to go to the school in your poor neighborhood, which would really reproduce the inequalities. So I'm wondering, how would you think on that? Do you think it's really, because you say TEOC is worse, but do you think this is better than TEOC or worse than TEOC? I'm really curious about your opinion. And my last question about the voucher system. Yes, you say that Turkish state defines itself as a welfare state, but with the strengthening of the neoliberal policies, we see that the government also designed voucher system. So if students are preferring to go to the private schools, as far as I know, private schools are able to get vouchers by the number of students or per students. So did you have a chance to sort of place of this increasing number of private schools, in your data? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chetin Hocam. And like you have like three different questions. You have asked three different questions, and like let me start with voucher question. yes, you are right. The number of private schools have been increasing in Turkey, and government from time to time supported these private schools. And if you remember, in 2013 and 14, government supported this transition from private tutoring centers into private high schools, so that they wanted to make dependency on these private tutoring centers in a more controlled way. So they wanted to decrease the dependency on these private tutoring centers. So voucher had very specific purpose at that time. And now some supporting systems have been continued, but not as that much as far as I know. Yes, the reasoning behind this had some neoliberal logic within that, because at that time, if you remember, some of the governmental spokespersons said that we wanted to alleviate the dependency on public school system. That's why we want to support those students who would like to go to private schools. Yes, they had some, but in terms of the constitution and in terms of the public legitimacy, I think still Turkish education system, when we talk with the officials or when we discuss this issue publicly, still it's considered as a kind of public, kind of social welfare state, as far as in general public perception. And you had second question related with the neighborhood effect. Yes, this is a very problematic situation, because we see that dependency on the standardized exam creates inequality, but dependency on neighborhood creates another inequality for those students coming from less affluent background. That's why I think we need some selective schools for all students. But I am talking about whether this should be 10%, 20%, or 100%. And as far as I can see from our studies, we have to really keep into very small, 2% or 5%, so that students who go to the other types of schools still can have peers who are considered as successful. So we need a more positive school climate over there. But if we just select all the successful students and put them into certain schools, and the rest of the schools have just unsuccessful students, I think which is very bad policy, and it has very negative effects. Also, for these neighborhoods, we need better teachers, more with more seniority. Again, we come to the point in which our current public assignment policy for teachers, I think, is very bad. It doesn't take into consideration of equality or inequality. So we have to make some changes over there, because many studies shows that the quality of teachers is the maybe #1 factor in which we can change, or we can make some policies about it. And your first question relates with the language disadvantages. You are right. Those regions which are less developed regions are also Kurdish populated areas. And not from our national studies, but from international studies such as PISA, we know that those students who doesn't talk Turkish in their homes have lower scores in this type of assessments. And yes, I am sure there should be some connection between them, but the problem is officially as you may know, Turkish Statistical Institute doesn't ask this question, like language you talk in your home. So we had, I think, a problem regarding data, but this is a policy area that we have to, I think, work on. This is a big, I think, area of concern. I agree with you.
Thank you, Hocam.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the question and thank you for the explanation. Bekir, by the way, if you feel like stop sharing your screen,
okay,
it's something that you can do if you want to. So we have more time for questions. If you have any questions, please do raise your hands. I think is there a hand raised somewhere? If not, then maybe I could squeeze in one question. So to me, it seems to me that everything that you presented here is quite a good example of showing how rich gets richer in any kind of context. And your study was really interesting in terms of not only in one aspect, but pretty much in every aspect that you looked at it as a confirmation that rich gets richer. And that's particularly true for Turkish education system too. So where do you think that there might be break into this system? I mean, you had pretty thought-provoking questions at the very end of your presentation, at the end of the slide. So I'm just wondering, what is it that we might do, or Turkey might do, to break this system somehow? Because any inequity study should adopt step-by-step approach. We're not going to change the system all at once and everything is going to be fine the next day. So what is the breaking point you think that we can find? We can make some progress towards providing more equitable system.
I think, I mean, public has huge trust in these objective standardized exams. And I think that's flawed. So we have to change that perception. So we have to bring more data and we have to start public discussion on this topic. Because people think that when we have this kind of objective tests, our system works in a fair way. But all of the data shows the otherwise. So I think we need more discussion about this topic. Like from a comparative perspective, as you may know, like in the United States, there are huge debates about this, whether these tests, objective tests, are fair or not. And there are a huge literature over there. And there are different systems in place. Like, for instance, in Texas, like if a student, according to their grades, if a student is in the top 10% of his or her high school, then he is automatically being admitted to a university or a college of his or her preference. So this is a way showing that there are some solutions possible without, like necessary link with a standardized test. And according to studies conducted in Texas about this like placement scheme, the result shows that in terms of socioeconomic status, the results are more positive. So like the students coming from lower socioeconomic status families, they have more chance with this system. So I think we need a way so that those schools which are in like more like poor neighborhood, they can also have more chance to go to a selective college or selective university. So in order for us to do that, we have to show public that grades could be designed in a way which we can trust those grades. They are valid predictors, etc. So I think we need a discussion about the role of grades and the role of exams in creating a fair education system.
Yeah, thank you. Agreed. I mean, more, I guess, outlets for graduates as well could also be something, just not necessarily 4-year bachelor degrees, but more different options, I guess, or opportunities.
Yes.
Could be something.
As you
Thank
know, in
Thanks.
Turkey, like we have like valedictorian students, like those students who are like at the top of their high schools. They can be placed in universities by considering their scores, and they have like a special quota for them. They can compete with each other. So all the valedictorians from the different high schools compete for those quotas. But again, the problem is all these students are valedictorian students, but they have to have good grades in, they have to have good scores in national exams. Again, the placement is based on national exams. So we have to create some other ways so that people can use standardized exam, but as well as grades. Nowadays, in our university entrance examination, about 90% of our points coming from the standardized part. So the grades is around like 7% or so, which is very small.
Yeah. Jonathan has a question.
Yeah. Bekir, thank you so much. That was such an interesting presentation, and yeah, I've learned an awful lot about the Turkish education system. Thank you. I had a question about the between school variance, and we talked about that a little bit already, especially in relation to the high school, the vocational high schools, and how they were different. And I guess my question is to do with some of the other studies that you've done. So you mentioned that you've done other qualitative studies, but potentially quantitative as well. Do you have a sense, I guess, the outcomes and the variance in terms of the outcomes assumes that all those who go to certain high schools want to achieve a bachelor. So for example, the big differential between at the vocational schools of those not going on to bachelors. I guess my question as I was listening was, well, do they want to do that? I mean, we're sort of assuming that everybody wants to go and do a bachelor's degree, but they might be perfectly happy being in a vocational high school and going and do vocational courses or whatever. And so I'm just interested in whether any of your other studies have picked up the what students or pupils desire to do and how this matches with that, either qualitative or quantitative, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, your comment, and we haven't done any study for this purpose, but I can comment on this. Like students go to vocational schools as a last resort most of the time. So those students who cannot be placed into science high schools or Anatolian high schools, they go to vocational high schools. So this is not really a decision or informed decision. This is a kind of last resort chance for them. So this is problematic. I mean, yes, you are right. I mean, if students were willingly going to vocational schools and like placement tests for bachelor programs is low, that's okay. That's not a big deal. And it should be that way, because the aim of the program is not to place graduates into, bachelor programs. But most of the time, like people choose, and I am saying people because the preference of high schools is not a matter for just that children, or that those children. It's a familial matter, like students and families together decide which schools they go to. And considering their age, they are like 14 years of age or 15 years of age when they go to, high schools. Of course, this is a familial decision. And most of the literature says that, they go to more academic schools if they are able to. If not, then they go to vocational schools. And this is a trap for vocational school as well, because those students who go to vocational schools are considered as not very able students, not very successful students. This is also not good for those schools, because if they were going to those schools by their choice, like perhaps their perception, their self-perception would be much better. So this is something that the current Ministry of National Education tries to create. They want to create a more positive image of, vocational schools. I think this is a right policy, but I think it has limitations because higher education system or like going into a selective higher education program creates more pressure from the above.
Yeah, I suppose like Murat was saying in terms of what are the solutions, and I guess part of that is the shift in discourse around the different kinds of outcomes that people could have or trajectories into which they go. You take someone like Germany. There's a parity of esteem when it comes to vocational courses compared to academic, or there's more towards that. So I guess some of it is around then shifting the way in which we think about or frame vocational and academic outcomes.
Yes, I agree.
And education. I think we've got another question from Furkan.
Hello, everyone can hear me?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much, Bekir Hocam, for this thought-provoking seminar and very good findings that shed light of inequalities to transition to higher education or before even secondary education. So I think we are in the discussions that reminds me that I think those things partly touches the centralist governance of education in Turkey, because we didn't see enough negotiations or discussions before implementing any policy, like you mentioned, lots of policy changes. So, and you said also those kind of studies help to publicize to the discussions. Do you think it's the way to kind of put pressure on policymakers, or do you think is there any kind of structural changes needed to make the system more democratized rather than centralized? Because, as Çetin Hoca said, for example, when students go earlier to the system, it will be make inequalities huge when, students go earlier. So this is, I think, unforeseeable before this policy, implementing this policy, making restricted like 10% of students to go schools, and all the results like inequalities or labeling you mentioned can be foreseeable, but we didn't see any discussion. So I would like to hear your opinion on that issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I agree with you. The problem is actually like the root problem is related with the way our system is structured. We have very centralized system with limited authority for district level or school level decision making, and we see this from like PISA studies. When we look at the distribution of authority from top to bottom, we see that all of the authorities are at the top in Turkish case, and maybe Greece is similar to Turkey, but apart from that, none of the OECD countries is having this kind of centralized system. But the problem is this: in Turkish case, at least from last 150 years, from Tanzimat era to today, okay, many things have been centralized, and a centralized system has a huge public legitimacy. Again, people think that instead of giving power to regions or cities, let's keep at the national level or central level. Again, we have to change this perception. Unless we change this perception, we cannot change the system, because people think that when you give authority to regions or districts or schools, they will abuse it. Okay, so they don't trust those people who are going to use their power. So we need to change that perception. And but let me also state this fact. We know in the world there are like good systems with centralized structures. We know good systems with decentralized structures. And we also know that bad systems with centralized structure or decentralized structures. So my point is this. I mean, yes, I think in Turkish case, we need more decentralization. But still, even if we continue this centralized system, we can run it better. We are not running it better. As you said, like we changed our system so many times in a relatively short time, and like when you go to the website of the ministry, you cannot see any like public reports for many of these systems. Like why we are making this change. Like you will see kind of like white paper or green paper or this kind of stuff in many countries, and you have to see that. Like people should be accountable to what they have done. You put your targets, you put your methods, and you put your results, and then you can compare all of this, and then you say, what we have done has been successful or not. So I think we need more evaluation studies of this, policy studies, which I don't think we have enough of them.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think it's part of bigger discussion about public and government and power relations between them. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. So we still have time for questions if anybody has any questions. It was indeed a very informative for me. Like that's a lot to learn actually. So I guess if we do not have any questions, I'm taking my time speaking a bit slower, but if we do not have any question, I think we can conclude in here, and would like to thank Bekir again for presenting over here, and it was a very nice presentation and a very lively discussion. So can we all in our own way clap Bekir for his presentation, and
so
together with your physically do that, or put your emoticon. That was very nice. Thank you. So in the closing moments of this seminar, again, thank you, Bekir. So let me talk about the next seminar that we have. The next seminar is going to be on Wednesday, 8th February 2023, and will be presented by Priscilla Echeverria de la Iglesia, and the title is The Pedagogical Agency Capacity in Novice Teachers, the Responsibility of Initial Teacher Formation Programs from a Critical Perspective. So hopefully you will be able to make into that seminar series as well. So the details will be on our department website. And thank you again for coming and joining. And once more, thank you, Bekir, for coming and presenting. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Murat. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank Melis for invitation. Thank you.